Ys 8 The Lacrimosa of Dana is a great game. The gameplay is fast and fluid, and the culmination of the party system Ys games. Its story is easily one of the best in the series, with Dana's personal arc even bringing me to tears. And Falcom took the best aspects of its Trails series to make some of the most well-written NPCs in all of Ys. This video, however, is not a review of one of Adol's best adventures into becoming the messiah of yet another culture. It is instead a look at and breakdown of the new PS5 port of this game. A sort of discount Digital Foundry video for people who like niche JRPGs. So with that said, we're going to be looking at how this PS5 version stacks up compared to its other ports on the PC, PS4, Switch and Vita, although those two to less of an extent, and whether or not I can recommend this version to you. Starting off, I think it's very important that this game is originally a Vita game. A Vita game that was remastered for PS4 with extra content. A version that was then ported to PC, and based off certain early screenshots of this PS5 version, was seemingly ported from the PC to the PS5. This was notable because when the first PS5 screenshots were dropped, it had a rendering bug with the tall grass that was previously exclusive to the PC version. Something that has not only been fixed on PS5 before release, but has also been patched on PC as well. Another indicator that this PC version was the basis for the PS5 version is a certain bug with the ambient occlusion, but we'll get to that later. The reason I bring this up is because while the porting process does give devs a chance to patch out bugs, it also means that there is a chance for more bugs to arise with each port of the game. With games like the first Devil May Cry getting more problems with each release on the PS2, PS3, PS4 and eventually PC. Luckily Ys 8 hasn't quite gone under that journey, but there were a few things that I do want to bring up. Now, this video is mostly going to be PS5 footage, but I will be throwing up the occasional bit of PS4 or PC footage as well. I will be labeling them accordingly, but just to make it easier, I have used all of the pirate costumes for the PS5 footage. Now, starting with resolution, since it is the easiest thing to talk about, Ys 8 on the PS5 is running at a native 4K 60 frames per second, which at first doesn't seem that much higher than the PS4 Pro's 1800p. However, it's a much more cleaner and consistent 4K to that of the PS4 Pros. This is because on the PS4 Pro version of the game, while the game runs at 1800p, this didn't extend to everything in the game. Certain effects like depth of field were still rendered at 1080p, meaning that you could see more jagged edges in the background whenever they'd use it. Luckily, due to the fact that 1080p blurs the image, that 1080p was a lot less noticeable. Something else the PS5 version has over the PS4 Pro version is that its menus are actually 4K as well, as the PS4 version was still designed for 1080p screens in mind, but then forced up to that higher resolution when playing on a Pro or a PS5. There is also a 120 FPS mode available on PS5, however, the activation of it is a bit weird. There's no in-game way to turn this on, and the only way to gain access to it is before booting the game to go into your PS5 system settings and force it to 1080p. If your TV or monitor is then capable of 120Hz, then the 120 FPS mode will be activated. It's not something I was personally able to test as I don't have a 120Hz TV. From what I've heard, however, it does run pretty well, even if it being at 1080p is a little bit underwhelming. Now, as for some of the PC upgrades that the PS5 version adopts, the two main things that NISA are advertising is the much better draw distance and higher quality shadows. The draw distance is just the max setting from the PC version, opting to render every single object in a scene at once. Something that is very inefficient and costly on performance for a lot of benefit that you probably won't be able to see as it's far away in the distance. However, due to this being essentially a Vita game, it's something that the PS5 can just brute force without having to worry about. And the result of it looks very good. The PS4 remaster of the game added a lot more things like tall grass and foliage to a lot of the areas compared to the Vita release. And while I never noticed the draw distance on PS4, It being pushed out on PS5 means that the prehistoric Isle of Seren feels a lot more lush and rich in its environments. The shadows are now at a higher resolution compared to the PS4 release and also use a better filtering method. Just like the shadows, this was something that on PS4 I never really noticed much problems with. However, there were a few things like the thin leaves of palm trees looking very jagged because of the lower shadow resolution. The new shadows look a lot sharper than they did before, which is both a good and a bad thing. The new filtering method allows for shadows to be a lot more dense, as the PS4's version tended to diffuse the shadow's image quite a bit. The new method on PS5 seems to be based off the second option on PC, which does leave a lot of the jagged edges on the shadows still visible, which means that when moving around there's quite the bit of shimmer. It's a bit of a shame because the highest quality shadow filter on PC does have the best of both worlds for it. However, I guess this option was either too expensive for the PS5 to handle with everything else going on as well, or they went with the slightly crisper shadow filter as it looks better in comparison screenshot. And speaking of shading and shadowing, something that I did notice is the game is a little bit darker overall, and that's probably due to the new ambient occlusion. Something that I have mixed feelings on. Ambient occlusion is typically used to give a bit of more realistic shading to an environment, and gives objects a place in the world without having to give shadows to everything and anything. The problem is, using a one-size-fits-all kind of shading solution for a game that's got a very clear anime art style does make it feel a little bit weird at times. Luckily, the PS5 version isn't using the PC's highest setting for ambient occlusion, as HBAO Plus does tend to make the game feel a little plasticky looking, but also has quite a few bugs in the PC version of Ys 8, specifically when character models get a little bit too close together on screen. They instead decided to go with the option that's a lot cheaper on performance cost, but also a lot more subtler, and one that I think is definitely a better option of the two. However, there is still a weird bug in place that I think is caused by this ambient occlusion, which is in certain lighting conditions, characters will occasionally have a black line that goes all the way down the center of their face, with Adol being one of the main people who has this happen to them. And this is something I'm able to recreate on both the PC and the PS5 versions that I never noticed in the PS4 version. The final major improvement of the PC version that is unfortunately lacking in this PS5 version is the high quality texture pack that is available. It's for the most part a pretty minor, subtle AI upscale to all of the textures, so it's not a huge loss. However, there were certain character textures like Dogi's belt, or the back of certain characters' jackets and such, that did really benefit from having this, as they were a little bit muddy. It was also pretty good at hiding the pixelization of certain textures in the environment as well, which is something you probably want for a 4K display, but it's really not the end of the world that it's not there. Finally, there is one pretty glaring issue, at least to me, with this PS5 version, and it's something exclusive to this PS5 version, and that is that the ripple or shimmer effect that is on water is just completely gone. It's something that before I think really sold the tropical Mediterranean aesthetic of Ys 8's island, and with it gone, a lot of the water looks a lot more murky and lifeless, which is a really big downgrade. Hopefully this is just a bug and it's something that will get fixed in a later patch, but I'm not 100% sure that's going to happen. Finally, to end on a more positive note, something the PS5 port does have is all of the cosmetic DLC. This is important to mention since a lot of the DLC was exclusive to certain versions of the game. The Vita and the PS4 version of the game both had DLC costumes that weren't available in the other version of the game, and while the Switch version did get all of them, it didn't get the Japanese exclusive DLC that we never got, so it's nice to see them all in one place for once. Something to keep in mind, however, is the costumes that were originally exclusive for the Vita version are lower poly from the PS4 counterparts, not to mention their textures being a little blurrier too. It's not a huge difference, but I did notice that Adol's hair looks significantly worse with these costumes, and his ear was completely flat. It's understandable since they are just forward porting the Vita models into the new version of the game, and updating them to the PS4's quality wouldn't be much easier than just making brand new costumes and models, so It's not something I'm really disappointed by, but it is something to keep in mind. And with that all said, lies the question, is the PS5 version worth it? And honestly, I don't think you can go wrong with the PS4, PC, or the PS5 version, as they're all pretty decent and have their own benefits. The PC version probably wins out on pure visuals just slightly, but it pays that price with having less DLC compared to the PS5 and PS4 version, and also being a slight bit more unstable than those as well. You also need a machine that can actually run it. The PS5 version does have all that DLC and is probably the most clean looking console release, but ultimately stuff like the lack of water effects present in all other versions of the game and stuff like the shadows being a little bit of a weird choice just makes the game that ever so slightly bit less authentic. And the PS4 version, while feeling the most consistent and true to the game, definitely has those problems like the PS4 Pro support being a little bit of a weird 4K, and while it is 60 FPS for the most part, there is definitely certain things like the night raids that will cause the frame rate to absolutely plummet in some areas. NIS America is selling the PS5 port at a discounted price, and I think that's a really good call, since even to a newcomer, I'd struggle not recommending the PS4 version on a PS5 considering just how cheap it is to find these days. Especially since while I haven't personally tested the specific areas, I think it is possible that the PS4 version on a PS5 probably has a very good chance of eliminating those few frame rate drops that is really the only problem it has other than its sort of wonky 4K, and this is all despite the fact that there isn't a free PS5 upgrade path. The PS5 port does have a lot of neat little improvements, but I really don't feel like it's enough to warrant double dipping if you've already got the game. And depending on where you look, you can find the PS4 version considerably cheaper, and if you can, then that is the version I recommend. But if you can't, if the stock is running dry on the PS4 release and the prices have suddenly gone up a bit, then yeah, the PS5 version is definitely not a bad way to go. If you're a newcomer to the East series and you're thinking about picking it up, but you still can't decide at the end of this video, then just flip a coin, you'll probably be fine either way. If you're a Falcom fan and you enjoyed this video, then I want to recommend both my Trails from Zero review that I released fairly recently, please watch it, it needs the views, and my other port report of the Japanese release of the PS4 version of Nayuta no Kiseki, or Nayuta Boundless Trails. That video is technically a little bit outdated now because a couple of months after I released it, they did release a patch that updated a lot of the character textures, but other than that, it's all still completely valid and will give you a good semblance of an idea of what our release next year will look like.